Right, good afternoon everybody. Thanks for that, Caroline. Set the scene for the next stage. And I don't know how many of you attended the HGC agronomy workshops back in 2011, where I reviewed a number of insects and talked about whether or not they were potentials for the Premier League of pests. And those insects included yellow cereal fly, they included cereal leaf beetle, and they included saddle gall midge. And we eventually concluded that of the three, saddle gall midge really had the potential to move up to the Premier League and cause significant losses. Now, as the pundits are very keen to tell us, football's a funny old game. And of course, by May 2011, Blackpool, one of the teams that managed to make it up to the Premiership, had then been relegated. So although saddle gall midge, we likened saddle gall midge to Blackpool, we're now in a situation where we could answer the question, is saddle gall midge actually due for relegation? Well, because of the lack of information on saddle gall midge, with some help from HGCA and Dow, we undertook a very short monitoring project last year to look at the pest and get more information on it. Basically, can we follow its development in soil by soil sampling? Can we monitor its emergence using things like yellow sticky traps? Is soil sampling a good indicator of what's happening in the soil and when the beast is going to turn up? And also, can we monitor met data to try and link the met data with the development of the pest in the soil? So first of all, we obviously have to find some monitoring sites, and we were lucky there. We were able to liaise with Andrew Cotton, who found us two very good sites in Buckinghamshire, where there had been a previous history of significant saddle gall midge damage. Now, we started the monitoring in February and went right through to June 2012, and the reason we did that was because we didn't want to miss anything. We wanted to start early and catch all the stages of the pest in the soil. And obviously, funding for this survey was provided for HGCA, with also some additional funding from Dow, which allowed us to monitor a second site. So how do we actually go about monitoring? Well, I talked about soil sampling. It's not particularly high-tech, but just sort of give you an idea of what's involved. You basically go out with a golf hole borer, you take 20 cores, you end up with about 20 kilograms of soil. You lug that back to the lab, and you wash it through this series of sieves. And you can see from the top of the apparatus down to the bottom, the diameter of the sieves decrease. Ultimately, the insects and little bits of organic matter flow over, and you collect them in a collecting sieve at the bottom of the apparatus. You then submerge that collecting sieve in saturated magnesium sulfate, which is incredibly dense. All the insects float to the top with the little bits of organic matter, and you pick them off. So it's not particularly high-tech, but it certainly works for things like orange wheat blossom midge, and there's no reason why it shouldn't work for saddle gall midge. So, did we find anything? Well, yes, we did. First of all, it's very encouraging that we're able to pick up the larvae from the soil samples. You can see there the picture of the larvae. They're these orangey, reddy beasts. They're quite easy to pick out, and you can see from the two sites that at Wendover we had in excess of probably 1,500 larvae per metre squared, so significant numbers. And also at Cadmore End we're getting up there towards 1,200 per metre squared, so significant numbers of larvae there. And the other interesting thing you'll note is that the numbers of larvae basically decline with time. And I guess you'd say, okay, we would expect that because they then turn into pupae, and they then turn into adults. So you'd expect the numbers of larvae to decrease. So did we find any pupae? Well, yes, we did. But initially, straight away, you can see the numbers of pupae that we found, in terms of numbers per metre squared, significantly lower than the numbers of larvae. So we were only finding up to about 60 there per metre squared, in comparison with over 1,000 larvae per metre squared. So quite a difference in the numbers. Also, two peaks in pupation there, and pupation not starting until perhaps mid-April in 2012, whereas in 2011 we were already getting reports of adult midges in crops. So the next question is, can we pick up the adults? Sorry, I'll just show you a quick picture here of the pupae. This is what we're looking for in the soil. This is a newly developed pupa. This is a final form pupa. And the interesting thing here is you can see the 6 legs that you see with all insects. You can see the wing buds. And once you get to this stage, then you know that in a not too distant future, you're going to get adults. So that was the next stage. Can we trap the adults with yellow sticky traps? The answer to that is yes, we can, but not very many. So you can see there, we never exceeded half a midge per trap per day at either of the sites. So again, this is quite interesting. We've got all these larvae, we've got pupae, and we're finding even lower numbers of adults when we get to this stage of the monitoring procedure. But it is quite interesting that we are able to pick them up on yellow sticky traps. So what's happened to all these missing larvae? And I've basically just shown you this slide to give you, show you the comparison between larval numbers and pupal numbers. Pupal numbers in purple, larval numbers in blue. And okay, the larvae numbers decrease as you'd expect, but there's no real significant increase in the numbers of pupae as we might have expected as well. Also, again, like I said, interesting that the numbers of pupae were starting to pick up pupae much later in the season than we had done in previous years. So what's actually happening to these larvae? Well, there are a number of possibilities. And firstly, Caroline's shown you, and you've seen the pictures of the larvae on the soil surface. They're very bright, so they're very easy to spot. So you can quite imagine birds coming down and picking them off quite easily. Secondly, it's possible that they emerged, but we didn't catch them on the sticky traps. But we didn't really get any significant reports of large numbers in crops in 2012, so we suspect that that was not the case. Now, the other possibility, I guess, is that they can actually move down the soil profile. We know orange wheat blossom midge can and ah as to about when they're going to emerge, and if the conditions aren't right, they don't emerge. Is the same true of saddle gall midge? And we don't really know that at this stage. Of course, the other possibility is they just succumb to the British weather. I mean, that's no surprise. It's been absolutely lousy this year, and you can imagine that some of these beasts in the soil could quite easily have drowned. Finally, they could have been controlled by natural enemies. And do they have natural enemies? Well, yes, they do. We were able to pick out parasitized pupae from the soil. That's a parasitized pupa on the left there. And if you leave those in the lab for a reasonable number of time, you can hatch the adult parasitic wasp. And you can see the wasp there on the right. But I suspect that the numbers of parasites wouldn't have been sufficient to cause such a dramatic reduction in the numbers of larvae. So, conclusions from our monitoring program. Well, first and foremost, soil sampling is very effective for monitoring the development of midges in soil. So we could use that in another season at indicator sites to give us some idea of when they're likely to emerge. So we can use it as an early warning of midge emergence. Now, I said we monitored metadata, but there was nothing really in the metadata that we could use to say that was a definite indicator of when the different developmental stages of the midge occur in the soil. I mean, which is perhaps not surprising from 1 year's data. And we need perhaps to collect more data over a number of years before we can start to actually pick up some relationships between metadata and midge development. The other interesting thing, of course, is that high larval numbers don't necessarily mean yield loss. We had well in excess of 1,000 larvae per metre squared, and yet we had very few reports of significant yield loss in 2012. And finally, what happened to the missing larvae? Well, we haven't really got an answer to that at the moment, but clearly there was a significant reduction in the numbers of larvae between the early stages of the monitoring program and what happened later. So there is the potential for for follow-up work on saddle gall midge, and there's a possibility of some work in preparation. And we think that this work should really concentrate on four areas. Firstly, we need to understand more about the life cycle of the midge. I've already said, does it move up and down the soil profile? We don't know. but it'd be relatively easy to take soil samples at different depths and actually count the numbers of midges and see whether or not they move during the season. We need to know how the midge impacts on yield. We've already said there's huge numbers of larvae and yet very little impact on yield. So we need to investigate that in more detail. Caroline's already mentioned chemical control options, and we need to know about when, if we do need to apply chemicals, when they should be applied. And finally, of course, there's absolutely no thresholds whatsoever for saddle gall midge, and that's another area of interest because to a certain extent there might be some level of tolerance within the crop to saddle gall midge damage. So to consider those in a bit more detail, first of all, understanding the life cycle. Really, we need to continue this monitoring program. We need to look at the midge development and its time of emergence, and we need to link that to metadata to see whether or not there's any potential for developing a model which will allow us to predict when saddle gall midge is likely to emerge. I said we use yellow sticky traps to catch midges. We didn't catch very many, so are we using the correct type of trap? Should we be using other types of traps to try and catch more midges? Is there something else that's more effective? How does saddle gall midge affect yield? I've already said that we had masses of larvae and yet we didn't really have any significant impact on yield whatsoever. Does the effect of the midge vary between wheat and barley? You can imagine that that might well be the case, depending on how those two crops grow. And equally, is there a very simple relationship between the numbers of galls on the plant and yield? All things that potentially we could investigate. Chemical control, well, you know there's no approved products, although there are products you could apply at the appropriate time which are likely to give you control. Caroline said there's a very short window of opportunity to treat this thing. You need to get at it while it's on its journey from the leaf down the stem beneath the leaf sheath. And if we're going to treat at that time, what are the best chemicals we can apply to achieve optimum control? And what should we use to trigger the timing of those chemicals? Can we link it some way, perhaps into midge emergence on yellow sticky traps or some other type of trap? Finally, can we develop any sort of economic threshold for midge? We already can say with some degree of confidence that the numbers in the soil are not a reliable indicator of risk. And the chances are that the timing of emergence of the midge, the growth stage of the crop, are all factors that are going to be important in determining whether or not there is significant yield loss. And we can potentially work with the physiologists here to look at potentially tiller number, the growth stage at the time of emergence, and use all this to develop some sort of risk assessment method which will allow you to predict whether or not a particular crop is likely to be risk of attack. So finally, I guess to go back to my original question, is saddle gall midge in danger of relegation from the Premier League of pests? And I think probably not. I think it's managed to establish itself in the Premier League now. I think it's probably more likely to be closer to Wigan Athletic than Manchester United. It's never going to challenge for the Championship or the European League, but it's always potentially there in the background to cause damage if you're not careful, and it can easily catch you unawares. And I think the next slide. Finally, this is just to remind you that I think you've all received from HGCA a little form to help target future pest research. And this is basically just, please fill these reforms in on behalf of HGCA, because the data that they get from these forms will help them to prioritise pest research in the future. Thanks very much.